The idea that every single North Korean person was oppressed or suppressed. The idea that North Korea is a complete gulag. For sure, there's segments of the population suppressed. There's no doubt there are people that are being thrown in jail for political purposes. There's no doubt that there are political purges where people are killed or they're committing suicide. Yet at the same time, we have to be able to open space for understanding that hundreds of thousands of North Koreans fought against South Koreans. They fought against the Americans. They fought against the UN forces. And when the war finishes in 1953, those hundreds of thousands of people who often paid a very dear price for their opposition worked to support the North Korean regime. Whatever their motivation was, right? It's hard always to find out what the motivation. Maybe some of them were sincere socialists. Maybe some of them were sincere nationalists and they liked what the North had to offer more than the South. Maybe some of them were just careerists, right? There's all sorts of ways that we can try and understand, but people were identifying with and working for the North Korean regime. And it's only if we begin to make space to try and understand that, and it's not easy to figure it out, right, exactly how that's working in the 1950s. But it's only if we can begin to understand that, can we begin to understand why North Korea has now outlasted in duration the Soviet Union in its longevity. It's been there for a long time now, and the rumors that it's about to collapse have been going on for at least 30 years as I can remember, and it doesn't collapse.
Welcome to another excellent episode of Actually Existing Socialism, the show where we get to hear from people who live in a socialist country, have lived in a socialist country, or who've studied one extensively. This is your host, Tony, and what you just heard was a short clip from today's discussion featuring Andre Schmid. In this fascinating episode, Andre Schmid joins to discuss his recent book entitled North Korea's Mundane Revolution, Socialist Living and the Rise of Kim Il-sung, 1953 to 1965. Andre is the associate professor in the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Toronto. His research interests include, but are not limited to, the cultural history of the Cold War and Korea. This show is 100% listener funded, so if you do wish to contribute to ensure that the show goes on, you can become a Patreon subscriber at patreon.com/AESthepodcast, where you'll get access to a variety of bonus content. For example, an additional discussion I had with Andre about being an academic who does work on the DPRK, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is North Korea's official name. With that said, I'd like to take a second here to shout out to my newest patrons since the last episode, their names being Scott Brogan, Cobblehill Kami, and Lucas. This show could not function without your support. If you're unable to contribute in that way, not a problem. You can help out by sharing this episode by following us on Twitter and Instagram at AESthepodcast. You can also subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Feel free to leave a review, even if it's just a star rating, as those boost the algorithm in my favor. I recommend checking out the back catalog as well when you have the chance. As always, what you can really do to help the show the most is by engaging in local worker struggles, whatever form that may be. Enjoy the episode. I'm very excited and honored to welcome Andre to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much, Tony. Looking forward to talking to you.
So I know listeners are going to love this conversation because we have talked about North Korea on this podcast, or the DPRK, but not really from a historical or political standpoint. We've actually had two different tour guides give us their own experiences of traveling back and forth into that country, which I recommend people check out those episodes. And I guess out of curiosity, have you had the opportunity to visit?
Yep. I went on one of those tour guided trips about 7 years ago now.
Awesome. No, that's great.
It was really interesting. Gotta say, it was really interesting. Couldn't do much research, of course, but had a really fascinating time.
My hope is one day to join one of those. Andre, what I like about your work is that it really kind of fits in with the project of this podcast itself, which is getting into those finer details of how socialist societies are formed, the good, the bad, and the in-between of that process. Deeper than the narratives that we are generally presented with in popular media, which either starts from an anti-communist perspective or even an Orientalist perspective, particularly when talking about the DPRK. So we just love learning about how people had agency in these societies that are often presented as being like perfectly totalitarian, where everyone's like kind of a robot, which I'm sure you've encountered before. So before we actually get into the details of the topic, what got you into studying the DPRK in the first place?
Partly a little bit about what you just were talking about. I self-style myself a historian of modern 20th century Korea. My previous work always predated the formation of North Korea. And the truth is, people weren't studying much academically about North Korea. And so it was a little bit frustrating when I had students asking me questions and the like about North Korea, and I didn't really have answers. And at the same time, well, last 2 decades, North Korea has been so much in the headlines, right? And when you read the stories about North Korea, you can see that Orientalism coming out. You can see that anti-communism being so fundamental. So anybody who's at all sensitive to the history of the critiques of Orientalism and anti-communism is aware that these stories just don't tell us what we need to know. They're just exaggerations. They're cartoonish type representations of the country. And so, finally I felt like I had a little bit of a responsibility to try and do some actual historical work on North Korea. Things have been changing, right? And so I think especially if you went to Seoul, right, in South Korea itself, there have been a lot of changes in the way North Korea has been studied. Before, they had some really draconian national security laws that stopped scholars there from studying about the North Korea. That's changing as well. I don't want to present myself as being this one figure, right? There's other people working in English, other people working in French, but especially in Korean, that over the last, I'd say, 10 years have been just really pumping out a lot of work on North Korean and changing our way we understand it.
And that effort is, I think, much appreciated by listeners of this podcast and many others who just really want to have a deeper understanding of the country itself.
Well, maybe I could add one other thing, and that is I'm really aware through work like you do on this podcast, other historians working on socialism in other countries, just how much further our understanding of socialism has gone since the Cold War. And when I was reading that research, say on Stalinism or on East Germany and the like, you could see that there were dynamics that would apply to North Korea. People just weren't pursuing them. And true, we don't have opened archives, right? We don't know, we have no equivalent to the Stasi records for North Korea. Yet a lot of the questions that were being posed in these other socialist settings, even if we didn't have the archive to answer them in detail, the questions themselves provoked me to think in different ways and made me realize, that we just don't know what's going on in North Korea. And we got to think about those questions, even if we can't get quite as fulsome of answers as in those other places.
That's a very good point. And that's one thing that I love doing is, drawing these connections between these countries when sometimes it appears that there technically shouldn't be a connection between, people in Korea and people in East Germany. Like, how does that, make sense? It kind of defies stereotypes. Actually, I have an episode coming up with Reka Krismanic, and she studies the Hungarian People's Republic. And part of her research has focused on female medical practitioners who actually practiced in North Korea during and after the Korean War.
Oh, great.
So just really interesting stuff about socialist solidarity.
I'm going to have to look at her research. There's another guy named Balázs Zolontai who's worked with Hungarian archives a lot to sort of write about political and economic history in North Korea. And I think there's also, I don't know if you've seen this book, Comrades of Color.
Oh, yeah, it's like an anthology.
Yeah, and in that, it's mainly about Vietnam, relations between East Germany and Vietnam, but also East Germany and Korea. So gradually there's more of this type of work coming out as transnational history begins to hit the socialist world in a way.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Let's get into that history then. So how did the North Korean Revolution come about in those post-war years? So I think generally the audience will have a basic understanding of the fact that, of course, Korea was under, Japanese colonialism for some time prior to World War II. And then after, or at the end of World War II, both the United States and the Soviet Union end up occupying different parts of the country. And so maybe starting from there, what leads to this communist or socialist force, I guess, taking power essentially in the northern part of the peninsula?
Well, there's a long history of socialism and socialist parties in the Korean peninsula under Japanese colonial rule. The Japanese were ruthless in terms of trying to root out the sort of formal organizations of communist parties, and they were incredibly successful at doing it. So a lot of the socialist parties moved outside the country. In fact, you can make an argument that the first Korean Socialist Party was set up in China and Manchuria area in 1917, right? And so we've got this constant sort of up and down, rise and falls of different types of socialist parties in and outside the peninsula itself, that when 1945 comes and there's this ostensible liberation, right, from colonialism. But as you said, the deal was then that it gets occupied by the Soviets and the Americans. All these leaders from socialist parties come back to Korea. And, there's a big political shuffle in the 1945 to 1948 period as those two powers try and figure out which of the local elites they're going to be working with. And each of those local elites has its own networks. And, sure enough, the Americans ally themselves with some conservative English-speaking types in the South. And in the North, eventually Kim Il-sung is chosen by the Soviets. And in 1948, both the South and the North set up official sovereign states, right? Both of which were claiming to represent the entire Korean peninsula and all the Korean people, which of course is the basis of the war that breaks out in 1950. The initiative taken by Kim Il-sung, I know some people at a certain point were wondering, whether he had been suckered into the war and all, but it's pretty clear that he worked pretty hard to convince the Soviets, Stalin, right, and convince Mao to sort of help him out, give him the green light to move south. The war doesn't unify the peninsula, right? And both South and North both made efforts to try and reunify the peninsula during the war. And the tragedy, the irony and the tragedy, is that the war ends up, roughly around the 38th parallel, which had been the dividing point prior to the war. So up to 4 million people killed and not much settled by the war. The war is incredibly important then for setting up North Korea, right? You can imagine basically got the tar bombed out of it. American Air Force pretty much had unrivaled access to the skies. The famous stories were that bombers were returning to their post, telling their commanders there was nothing left to bomb in the areas they had been sent. So 1953 really means a rebuilding for North Korea. And it means rebuilding in all sorts of ways, not just, cities and infrastructure, but, the party itself had basically become incredibly weak during the war. Kim Il-sung, he had been hiding from American bombing, images of him hiding in caves and stuff and trying to maintain his position, his rule over the country is pretty standard for that period. The other example that captures a little bit of that is that, they had to pass over control of their own military to the famous Chinese general Peng Dehuai. So even the Chinese are in control of the war. And we know, for example, that, villages around the northern part of the territory that had in the 1945 to 50 period had been controlled by a centralized state, basically regained their autonomy, right? Because there was no state apparatus uniting the country during the war. So starting in 53, the North Korean state, which everybody always speaks today as being such a powerful totalitarian type of state, right? It's actually incredibly weak, and it has to build up basic, even the party itself has lost huge numbers of membership to the war. People have been living without any contact with the state. So population registry, nobody knows who's living where. So basic sort of biopolitical projects of state governance have to be relaunched after 1953. So it's within that, of course, that in a way there's also, as the state rebuilds, an opportunity to remold things in certain ways, to reboot the socialist experiment that they had started in 1948. Lay the grounds for a socialist material economy, for example, and start various projects to try and improve life after the war.
Now that I think about it, I guess this might make the DPRK have a bit of a unique situation in terms of, well, I guess, every country has a unique situation to get to wherever it is. But in terms of, say, for example, of course, the Soviet Union, we have the October Revolution and the provisional government, and then that gets overthrown, and then the Bolsheviks come to power. If we look at the post-war Eastern European states, Poland or Hungary, they have kind of this like slow-moving constitutional revolution that's taking place where power is being taken by the communists, but it's not, say, for example, like what happened in 1917. And now in the DPRK, what we have, it seems like Kim Il-sung is and the Workers' Party of Korea. So they're the ones in charge before the war breaks out. And then the war breaks out and devastates things, kind of like, it's almost like creating another revolutionary, or creating the revolutionary situation, I guess, where now it's up to them and not an external force to move forward with that project.
Yeah, so when you compare it to the situation of other socialist states, it has some similarity to the Soviet Union insofar as it's like largely a rural country, poor, illiterate. So it's not like East Germany in that sense. It is like East Germany in the sense that, the Soviet Union has had a pretty darn important role The advisor governments that continue and the advisors that continue even after 1948 and come back after the war, those are really important. And, I think we can see some similarities between the situation of many Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union. Another difference, which you'd have to make a comparison to some of the countries in the developing world, because you got to think of North Korea as a decolonizing country as well, something that the Europeans can't speak about. So that is like fundamental to the entire worldview of everybody in North Korea, right? South Korea as well. And it manifests slightly differently in the North as it does in the South because of the socialism. So the socialism is always understood as being a decolonizing force in the North. And maybe, another comparison, Kim Il-sung himself regularly made this comparison with Eastern Europe. And I don't know if it applies so much to East Germany, West Germany, but because of the division in Korea and because there was pretty open population movement between 1945 and 1953, you had large swaths of the North Korean social establishment move south. Estimates put it 650 to 750,000 people. So people like landlords, businessmen, Christians, right, had this place to go to escape the persecution that they feared, often exaggerated fears, but not always, right? And not always, of the North. And at the same time, a smaller number, but a lot of the leftist intellectuals who were so important in the colonial period were drifting north, right? So there was this sort of winnowing of the population. So Kim Il-sung always spoke about this difference that he saw with most European countries, precisely because they didn't have sort of this remnant of the bourgeoisie that they always had to deal with. They didn't have a lot of landlords left in the North. And so one of the indications we see of that was when North Korea collectivizes land from 1954 to 1958. And even before that, in 1946, when they have a land reform movement, it's simply not as bloody. It's still violent, right? But it's not as bloody as what we see going on in China after its revolution, which is almost contemporaneous, or the one several decades before in the Soviet Union, right? Because there isn't that elite. And so when you think of China with those land struggles where landlords are put there and there's that sort of enabling of peasants to speak bitterness, as it was said, there's just not that type of situation in North Korea because many of the landlords have moved south already by that point. Depends upon your comparator, right? It's not that North Korea is a one-off. It just depends which aspect of the country's experience you want to compare to what other socialist countries. But it's always really healthy to bring North Korea into dialogue with those other historical experiences. Too often today, right, down to this day, it's just seen as being this bizarro, unique place. And that's not the way to understand it historically, I don't think.
Yeah, no, certainly. It kind of reminds me of this idea that Samantha Lom, who's a Soviet historian, informed me of, and it's this idea of, she called it Soviet exceptionalism, in the sense that people look at the Soviet Union as being just this kind of like, as all the rules don't apply there. It's just a totally different existence of humanity. So, you can't make any comparison to it because it's just the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah, not.
Yeah, it's just a very limited view.
Yeah, it doesn't help us understand any country when you put it in a position of being incomparable to others.
Following on that thread, as you mentioned, what happened in China, there's kind of like that. You call it maybe even like a secondary revolution. I think maybe that's what the phraseology they may have used in experiencing the Cultural Revolution, and the Soviets experiencing, rapid industrialization and collectivization. It's kind of like a furthering of the struggle that their initial revolution had begun. And as you mentioned, often bloody, fighting against people who were called kulaks or landlords or etc. And so you're saying that this process happened in the DPRK at a very limited scale because the situation was different, as in they didn't have these kind of lingering elite class that existed.
It's still an important element in the post-53, the post-war period. They do set up, like in other socialist countries, a sort of a political labeling project, right? It's called the Songbun system, right? Where people get labeled according to three different classes at first. One of them, the low one, being enemy category, right? And if you had anybody in your extended family who was part of that enemy category, the whole family would get slotted into that. So landlords would certainly be that. Big businessmen, if they were caught, would still be in that. For the most part, though, it was more of a loyalty labeling project insofar as it was really, if you worked for the Japanese, if you collaborated with the Japanese during the colonial period, you were in that enemy category. If you wore a South Korean uniform during the Civil War and you got caught behind in North Korea, you and the rest of your family would be in that category, right? If you were in any way seen as working against the party in its initial formative period, you would be slotted into that category. So that's still an important part of the population control at that part. At this moment, it's getting set up for the whole country in late 50s. By 59, everybody has a card, an identity card with that stamp on it of their category. There's a lot of talk about that down to this day amongst human rights critics of North Korea who look at this as being, really one of the big problems in North Korea. And it's true, it's pretty terrible if you get slotted into that enemy category. There's a little bit of a tendency upon many of the human rights groups that speak about this to look at it as a static system, when I think anybody who, is aware of state projects that try and categorize, really complicated social relations in their localities, knows that those programs don't really work, that people are able to game the system. So there's all sorts of other problems with it. So what the rules are on paper is not what seems to have been happening always in actual fact. And on top of it, North Korea has this big problem, especially after the war, when, you've lost something around 12 to 15% of the population to mass death, is that you don't have enough bodies for your labor force, right? So there's a real pressure, a real shortage of laborers. And that pressure on the need to find more workers is sort of a counter pressure to that political loyalty labeling campaign, right? Because some of those people, they need them to work. And so you can imagine how those two demands might work against each other. But it's also in this period that the party really expands its size and its scope. And, if we want to ask questions about what was revolutionary in this period, what's pretty clear is that the Korean Workers' Party completely changed the social status of the elite group in North Korea. By the late 50s, the party consisted really of workers and farmers. The elite groups who had ruled Korea through the colonial period and even further, they're pretty much all gone. So there's a real turnover on that front. And associated with that turnover, one of the places where you can see real changes is also the economy. By 1958, it's completely collectivized. So what few private agricultural lands existed had been brought back into the cooperativization movement. By 1958, what private commerce had existed, if you'd been in Pyongyang in 1955 after the war, you would have seen lots of private restaurants around the streets, right? By 1958, those are all gone. It's all brought back into the public distribution system. So there's a real claim by 1958 that the country has, at the level of the material economy, been socialized. I think the other argument you can make would be that there's been significant changes, and there's a lot of debate about this, but still significant changes on the gender front. In 1946, so this is just 1 year after being liberated from colonial rule, when North Korea is still under Soviet occupation, there's promulgation of a gender equality law. And that's the first law of its type in all of Asia, right? It's pretty historically important. Like every law that we've seen around the world about gender equality on the books, right? We know it's not lived up to. And so one of the questions is always tracing how that's attenuated, how it's weakened, how it's used. But it's pretty clear by the 1950s that one of the effects of this law is that women have been able to really push and advance themselves into all sorts of new occupations. They might not be near the power positions at the top of the party and things like that, right? But we find lots of cases of women being biologists, being architects, right? In really advanced intellectual work. They're working in heavy industry factories, right? Doesn't mean there's not segregation of labor. Doesn't mean that on a wider scale, women don't have lesser jobs that pay less well, that are in less safe conditions, right? Yet the changes are still really quite remarkable. So that's some of the revolutionary change. And I'd say the only other thing that's really important in this period in North Korea, especially in comparison to what's going on in the South, there's a very established critique of capitalism. A critique of capitalism that is very much about the position of the United States in the world, about the position of the United States military. And that's going to be important in the 50s, 60s, even 70s on the international front, partly because of the types of alliances that North Korea makes. And there are some really important ones with Cuba, with Vietnam, that sort of positions these three small socialist countries against even the big socialist countries. There's a sensibility that even the Soviet Union and the Chinese can't really capture that critique as powerfully as these smaller countries.
One aspect I wish to explore further are these links that the DPRK has to all of these, we'll call them smaller nations. For example, I actually forgot this. I haven't only talked to tour guides. I actually had a conversation with Monica Macias. Her father was the leader of Equatorial Guinea, I believe, in the 70s. He was their first democratically elected leader after, decolonization. And her father ended up being assassinated at home. But prior to that, he had sent Monica, his daughter, to the DPRK to study. And so she ended up, I'm sure you've heard this story, but she ended up living probably from the ages of about 5 to all the way through university there till when she had an opportunity to leave, and she took that opportunity to leave. It's just fascinating. I also think that, they had links to Grenada, under the New Jewel movement there.
Guyana had North Korean advisors that were teaching children in Guyana how to do the sort of North Korean mass games, in the belief that it was sort of a type of disciplinary procedure that would help them in the future economically. So yeah, there's all sorts of... Ethiopia had ties, right? So there's a lot of interesting sort of south-south ties, circulations that when we're always fixated on either the metropoles of the socialist world or of the capitalist world, we tend to forget there are these other circuits and networks that are being pursued that are often really interesting.
I think a key, of course, topic or overarching topic of your book is this phrase, this project that is used to, encapsulate what is going on in the DPRK in this early period after the war, and it's New Living is what it's called. And you kind of touched on it, when you addressed some of the gender changes. Could you explain to us what this, socialist New Living was?
The New Living was basically an attempt to imagine a future mass utopia that would be achievable through socialist practices. In a general sense, it's that utopia, that ideal that everybody was pursuing, with the understanding that even though the economy had been collectivized by 1958, they still faced all sorts of challenges that needed to be pursued, that needed to be remedied. And it becomes a question of, well, what are those? I should say that the New Living itself is not a specifically socialist term. It had a long history in Korea and in East Asia more broadly. It's basically a term that develops in the 1920s that is sort of a reformer, a call for reform under colonialism in Korea, but also in China against Western imperialism, in the sense that there was this understanding that for nationalist reform to occur, people had to change the ways they thought and the ways they behaved, right? So it's this idea of reform in your daily life. So if in that earlier period, this was really about modern reforms, by the time the phrase gets revived in North Korea, that modern reform is being glossed as socialist reform. And so one of the ironies is that we see that as much as there's all this call for revolution in North Korea and this belief that they've separated themselves from that inherited national past, because of this sort of constant call for reform resting on the efforts of individuals to change themselves, right? Within the New Living in the socialist era, there are sort of this uncriticized continuity of certain types of practices that are now harnessed to the socialism. And so what we find in New Living is that on the one hand, this radical type of call for changes that are going to fit in with the collectivization of the economy, right? And all that requires in terms of work practices, new understandings of what socialist value, for example, means. You also have these calls for change or practices that are in some ways quite conservative, right? That are about social discipline, social order. Things like lining up for the bus, not talking in the theater, right? They're all coming together in a single package. Serious stuff, right? And then on top of it, you get the socialist practice of self-criticism and small group criticism, on which this stuff can be sort of added, right? Or the criticism can be directed towards the way certain practices are harnessed to the new life. So there's a lot going on in here, and it's one way we have to see North Korea as connected not just to other socialist countries, but understand it as being sort of in the middle of a long 20th century of Korean history, where the people in the cities in their everyday lives, it's not like they've suddenly been cut off from the colonial period, much as the rhetoric would like to imagine itself as being a completely new rebirth under socialism.
How I'm interpreting this new life, or maybe drawing an analogy to, is this concept of the new Soviet man, woman, the new Soviet person, except instead of, it being this idea encapsulated in the context of, the former Tsarist empire and stuff like that, it's rooted in, this long Korean history. So it's kind of like a new socialist person with Korean characteristics.
That vocabulary isn't so widely used in Korea, like the new socialist man, or sometimes you get new socialist person in Korea. But for the most part, that's why I chose the new living rather than that, because it's a term that doesn't appear so much in the Korean situation. Might be a slight leaning in the Korean situation towards a more collective understanding of that rather than the focusing on the individual. That's sort of difficult for me to understand, to make that comparison, because I don't know enough about the Soviet case. But there is this sense that every individual sort of has to work on themselves to self-improve. And that is a philosophy that is not unique to Korean socialism, but existed within pretty much every Korean nationalist movement. And so the decolonial part and the nationalist part coming together in the New Living is very much hinging on what that individual should be doing in order to help the transition to a full socialist country.
We're talking about the 50s here and the 60s. Could you give, maybe an example, if you can think of one, of what was life like? Essentially, I guess is what I'm getting to, is, how did people live during this time? Say, for example, let's start with Pyongyang. If you lived in Pyongyang at that time, what was an average person's life like?
In the 1950s, probably the most salient feature would be a certain degree of stability after all the tumult, because we want to remember it's not just the Korean War that has ravaged the peninsula for 3 years, from 1950 to 1953. We want to remember that there was a lot of fighting between, skirmishes, but still, between 1948 and 1950, over 100,000 people died in skirmishes in the peninsula. And that was only 3 years removed from Korea as being one of the key parts of an imperial structure that fought against China. So during the Japanese war against China, something like 15 to 20% of the entire Korean population was actually outside the peninsula. And if you think that most of those, the most famous of them are the comfort women, of course, yet most of those men, most of that population were males. And so it really skews the gender population within the peninsula. So there's this sense that there's been 17 years of war and unsettlement. And finally, 1953 comes around. And as much as the socialist regime is still bringing in lots of changes, it's a lot different than battles, being mobilized for war, being sent from home. People have a chance finally to rebuild, to reconstitute their personal lives, to try and figure out where their family members are, right? A lot of people didn't know where their family members were. And even if they suspected that they were on the other side of the demilitarized zone in South Korea, it was difficult to ascertain because there's no relations at all between the two halves. There's this stability that we don't want to underplay or forget. Cities are the heart of North Korea from the get-go, right? In Pyongyang especially. So the regime is interested in investing in the cities. It's industrializing. All of its money is going into industrialization. So from the beginning, we begin to see the development of a disparity between the countryside. One of the ways you can think of collectivization is it was one way of getting money out of the countryside into the hands of the state, which then invested it into the industries that are in the cities, of course. The big question that an average family would face would be, I think in the 1950s, two things. Where are you going to be slated in this political loyalty test? That's going to be so important by the end of that decade. And second of all, what type of job can you find? Those are incredibly important issues when you've got a centrally planned economy that is allocating jobs, and it's based on your job that you get your housing, right? And the implications keep going down. So for individual families, that's really what they're going to be thinking about at that time, how to master those different demands at a time that the economy is growing. And so that's the one thing that we want to remember is the economy in this period is growing. It's growing partly because, the war had destroyed so much. It gets this kickstart. It gets an investment from other socialist countries, but also because of the policies of central industrialization, which, as much as it has problems for, if you've got a good job, you're going to be doing pretty well in this period. And one of the things we can see from the records, the type of indirect evidence you find in the records is that there were a lot of people who had good jobs that sort of had more money than they could spend, right? Because the light industry economy was doing that. That's a story we've heard from other places as well. But we don't usually think of North Korea where there are significant portions of the population that have cash to burn, right? And it actually becomes a social problem. You can imagine in sort of the factories of young men that are working in the iron factories and there are hundreds of them and they've got too much money they can't spend. What are they doing? They're drinking, they're gambling, they're smoking. It's a mess. And so authorities are terrified of what's going to happen with all these young men with nothing to do, basically, with their money.
That's fascinating. You've given us kind of a glimpse now into what, concerns of an average person, particularly in the cities, would be at this time. I understand why people are interested in the grander narratives of, Kim Il-sung and what the leadership is doing. But with that said, your work focuses on particularly how everyday people interact with the party state apparatus with their projects. And I think that's one thing that I think unites all socialist projects. Say, for example, Lao, is the state's ability to mobilize people in support of those projects. And I think an aside from this concept is perhaps the issue of democracy, right? The DPRK presents itself as a democracy, as a socialist democracy. In the 50s and the 60s, how was this functionally expressed?
So I think, like everywhere else, it's the idea of a democratic centralism is what is presented. Yet I think it's pretty hard to find that. We want to remember here's another area where we can make a comparison with other socialist countries, since we know in 1956 at the famous 20th party plenum in the Soviet Union, when the criticism of Stalin comes down and the criticism of personality cult gets articulated, and as that spills over to the rest of the socialist world and the ramifications or what's it going to do to party leadership and the like, North Korea is pretty much able to avoid that. Kim Il-sung is able to control the impact. He's one of the countries, Romania would be another one. Clearly that personality cults that have been beginning in those two countries are not nipped in the bud by those types of conversations. The idea that it could be countered with a collective leadership that was more democratically oriented in North Korea never takes off. We get purges in this period, so that other potential centers of leadership, whether some groups or individuals that are well known in this period, are all eliminated. So basically by 1958, and certainly by 1961, Kim Il-sung's in complete control. Once he gains control, institutional control of the party and the levers of the state apparatus, you can begin to see the move towards the type of personality cult that we're more familiar with from the 70s and 80s, right? So there's a history to the personality cult, and that personality cult, of course, trumps any democratic rule for sure, even socialist definitions of a democratic rule. At the same time, right, what we don't want to conclude from that is that all ideas came from Kim Il-sung's head, right? We don't want to take the claims of the personality cult and reinforce them with the way we're saying it's anti-democratic and therefore everything is in his hands. And one of the things that's difficult for us to figure out, given the sources that we have of North Korea for this period, is the political decision-making process is still nevertheless really complicated. And there are still debates about certain types of issues within the party. We don't know how those are always settled. It's not always a matter of Kim Il-sung, or sometimes issues themselves aren't derivative of Kim Il-sung and his group. So, we know that everywhere in the socialist world, there was a debate about the balance between heavy and light industry. And we know that Kim Il-sung had a personal view on this, and we know he wins, and we know he uses his emphasis or his desire to emphasize heavy industry to turn against other people who disagreed with him, right? The debate itself, the policy decisions itself, they're not really unique to him or anything. It's not original, right? And later on, often in many different realms, he's credited with having an original position on these issues, when really there's a much more complicated history to those different types of policy decisions.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that we have Kim Il-sung sitting at the top of this political structure, him and, of course, his advisors, etc., in the party. But then when it comes down to, say, for example, the local level or even the regional level, is there a form of democracy that's taking place that isn't top-down?
Maybe I wouldn't quite use the word democracy in this particular case, but there's certainly a type of autonomy in regions. Right, an autonomy on how to get certain things done. So you'll have a policy resolution about the need to improve light industrial production. And one of the things the government does, or the central state does, is it downloads the responsibility for fulfilling the particular needs of the population in that province on the provincial authorities, who then sort of download it onto counties, and there's this constant, and everybody has a certain fiscal autonomy. And, what's driving this is partly there's not enough capital. There's not enough money to do everything that they want to do, right? And so what they're trying to do is pass responsibility for the things that they don't think are the highest priority down to lower levels of government, in the hopes that those lower level governments have access to certain amounts of capital that are not available to the central government. And so it's partly a strategy of trying to sop up extra capital, but also to use local resources for, local people know better where the local resources are, that type of logic. This creates certain unevenness again, because obviously cities are in better position to do that sometimes than rural areas. And there's poorer parts of the country as opposed to richer parts of the country, even in the rural areas, right? This downloading, or this granting of certain responsibilities to local areas is part of the proliferation of unevenness within North Korea as well, right? Not everybody has the same resources to pursue the same type of projects, and that leads to all sorts of difficulties.
You've explained to us what this concept of the New Living was. Does it today still have any afterlife, or is it a concept that's still part of that discourse within the DPRK, or is it something that's part of its past?
Yeah, so the New Living itself as a sort of basket term to gather a lot of practices together in the 1950s and 60s is now past. But the New Living in the 1950s and 60s always rested on a certain vision of the economy, a political economy, if you would. Couldn't but be resting on that. And, it's in these deeper ways that continues. So just what we were talking about, that relationship between the center and the localities and how that works it out fiscally in terms of responsibilities is still a really big dynamic in North Korea. In other realms, you can see the certain continuities, right? Earlier I mentioned gender and the difficulty historians have had in tracing exactly what went on. But one of the things we can certainly see is that there's, as much as there was this general impulse to open work avenues and how women were eager to go and get types of work that they had never had before and become very accomplished by the 1960s in all sorts of realms, there was at the same time what you can't help but see to be a simultaneous conservative impulse that stressed certain forms of femininity that were, had one function of containing the advance of women, had one function of naturalizing certain traits, if you would. I don't want to say naturalizing, certain traits that are being repurposed at that time that can't but be seen as being conservative. So the most famous example would be the way women's speech was being promoted at that time. So in the 1950s and 60s, as part of the New Living, you had all sorts of magazines basically instructing women in a form of feminine speech that was said to be modest. These are the types of adjectives that were used. Indirect. Much of the time when these are being described, you can imagine that the interlocutor is somebody who is male. And it's creating a gendered hierarchy. It also creates hierarchies amongst women themselves on who masters this type of speech as opposed to others. And it's not surprising that it's sort of urban elite women that are mastering it, and it's the older auntie in the countryside that is presented as being the opposite. We can see that these forms of femininity, and there are many types of them, speech is just one, they have an afterlife, even though they're not grouped in the New Living. So some of the women broadcasters on North Korean TV now are famous for the way they speak. And they have these very feminized, right? Most people think of them just in terms of the histrionics they go into. And that's not what I'm talking about, right? There's another level, which when you're listening to it in Korean, has feminized forms of conjugation, of indirectness, like I was saying. And I think we have to see the roots of what is now this very public performance of it back in the 1950s, if not earlier, when these lessons are appearing in all sorts of magazines and handbooks and etiquette guides and the like for women, right? So you can find it. It's not within that overarching framework of the New Living, but some of the practices that we see today go back to this period.
So to kind of round up our discussion here, what are some persistent myths about this era, the 50s, the 60s, or even, I guess, the DPRK in general that you come across, whether it's in popular media or in other scholarship you read, etc.? What's something that you think is just demonstrably untrue that you hear a lot?
That North Korea is a hermit kingdom would be one of them, especially for this period, right? This idea of an isolated North Korea. No North Korean in the 1950s or 60s would have possibly have conceived themselves as being isolated. There's all sorts of circulations going on with the socialist world. You know, the most famous one that shaped everybody's life in the cities was architecture. The new, modular forms of panel building apartments, which is being shared not just in the socialist world, but look at most university campuses in North America, and you can see that similar move towards cheap construction for large numbers of people. Translations that are being made. There's mothering guides to child rearing that are being translated from the Soviet Union, and people are reading them. There's Soviet plays being performed. The movie culture in North Korea is incredibly international at this time, right? It's an international of the socialist world for sure, but it's really important. So I would say isolation is certainly one of them. Another one that we touched on earlier, that North Korea is poor. Yeah, it was poor in the 1950s, as was South Korea. But, North Korea really jumpstarts its economy after the war. CIA analyses put the North Korean economy as doing better, right? And the CIA is not exactly known to be friendly to North Korea, right? But their own analyses suggest that North Korean economy was doing better than the South Korean economy into the 1970s. I would also say that, the idea that every single North Korean person was oppressed or suppressed, right? That's the idea that North Korea is a complete gulag. For sure, there's segments of the population suppressed. There's no doubt there are people that are being thrown in jail for political purposes. There's no doubt that there are political purges where people are killed or they're committing suicide. Yet at the same time, we have to be able to open space for understanding that hundreds of thousands of North Koreans fought against South Koreans. They fought against the Americans. They fought against the UN forces. And when the war finishes in 1953, those hundreds of thousands of people who often paid a very dear price for their opposition, worked to support the North Korean regime. For whatever their motivation was, right? It's hard always to find out what the motivation. Maybe some of them were sincere socialists. Maybe some of them were sincere nationalists and they liked what the North Korean regime had to offer more than the South. Maybe some of them were just careerists, right? There's all sorts of ways that we can try and understand, but people were identifying with and working for the North Korean regime. And it's only if we begin to make space to try and understand that, and it's not easy to figure it out, right? Exactly how that's working in the 1950s, but it's only if we can begin to understand that can we begin to understand why North Korea has now outlasted in duration the Soviet Union in its longevity. It's been there for a long time now, and the rumors that it's about to collapse have been going on for at least 30 years as I can remember, and it doesn't collapse. The third thing would be to get us back up to the personality cult of Kim Il-sung. I think there's this strange desire or pleasure that is derived from these cartoonish visions of Kim Il-sung and the Kim family in general. It's like we get pleasure from the bizarreness of the regime that's circulated in the press. And the idea that everybody believed every word that Kim Il-sung, that his words, that his word was the word. That's just not true from this period. There's a really historically complicated passage for him to rise to power, but at no time does he have that type of absolute power in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Most people don't listen to his speeches. Most of his speeches aren't even reproduced in the period. There's lots of speeches that we don't even know he gave we don't know about them until the 1980s when he gets a complete edition of his works come out. And suddenly we see there are these speeches that nobody had ever heard about because they weren't in the press at the time. So nobody knew about them at the time, right? So we have to have a much more complicated understanding of his rise to power, his words. And we have to stop sort of accepting the idea that this is the idea of the personality cult itself, that he's all powerful. Why the heck do we want to believe that? Right? We know better from our other histories. And so I'd say that is probably the uber myth of all in North Korea. And the irony is it's partly because that we get a kick out of some of the bizarre features of the consequences of that personal myth that we don't think critically enough about it.
So Andre, I just want to say thank you, for joining the show today for this conversation. And yeah, North Korea's Mundane Revolution. I highly recommend people check it out. We just barely touched on some of the main points in that book. I hope to have you on the show again, Andre, because North Korea is a topic that the history of North Korea is something that doesn't get much airtime. So I appreciate that.
Oh, it's been a lot of fun talking to you, and I agree. When your listenership sees these stories in their newspapers and these little clips on, the TV of, the classic sort of Cold War marching armies and the view stand, guys in my generation who lived the Cold War, I can see with my buddy, they get a real kick out of those images, right? It's sort of a safe way of boxing North Korea and these old style Cold War stereotypes that we know were, in a sense, defeated, right? They're sort of safe, right? In this sort of triumphalist view of the Cold War that we have. And so there's a certain pleasure to them. But what we have to really think about is how those interfere with a more complicated understanding. And given that North Korea is still with us today, given that there's all sorts of political problems entangled with the continued existence of North Korea, right? It's about time that we start shedding some of that conceptual dead wood from the Cold War and start thinking about North Korea in more sophisticated ways.